Hello. This message brought to you by Future Marie. When I went to edit this week's video, it turned out it was a hot mess express of blurry footage. I know it was a rookie mistake in my camera settings. Listen, it was my worst case scenario nightmare situation, but here we are. It happened. I don't have time to re-record it. The show must go on. And so I debated for a while, do I still edit this footage like a regular YouTube video or just release it as a podcast, or what should I do? So I just ultimately decided that I'm going to, of course, still release it as a podcast because the audio is all just fine. And on YouTube, I'm just going to release the podcast version as well. So if you are offended by blurry visuals without a bunch of, snappy edits, then you know what, hang tight for next week's video. But I am actually really excited about the topic of this week's video, and I'm so bummed that this is the video that came out blurry, and this week just happened to be too busy to re-record it, so it is what it is. Thank you for hanging with me, and without further ado, here is this week's minimally edited episode where I'm going to be blurry almost the whole time. Enjoy. What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of today's episode, where we're going to talk all about how to approach clients when they give us feedback in session. Whether it's constructive feedback, critical feedback, aggressive, uncalled for feedback, whatever kind of feedback it is, we're going to talk about how to respond when clients give us feedback in session. And before we dive in, a little disclaimer that's true for all of my episodes, and that's what I talk about here does not constitute professional clinical advice. If you're looking for some support when it comes to receiving feedback from your clients and how to approach it, I definitely encourage you to seek consultation, supervision, talk to a real other fellow human being about your specific situation. With all that said, I think it's really helpful to have guidelines to guide us when clients give us feedback, and we can know that there are nuances that happen in each individual situation that we can take into account. Now, before we dive into more specific guidelines of how to approach client feedback, generally, anecdotally, I've observed that therapists seem to lean more towards one extreme or the other in their general responses, particularly if there's any sort of insecurity, lack of confidence going on inside the therapist. Some therapists might lean more towards the extreme of taking all or nearly all of responsibility for whatever the feedback is about, regardless of the context behind it. So you might find yourself apologizing immediately or saying, I should have known better, next time I'll do it differently, that sort of thing. And in the other camp, there are therapists who lean more towards the extreme of almost universally taking a more defensive posture. Sometimes the defensive posture really just means deflecting the responsibility back onto the client. Oh, this is something about their presenting issue, their pathology that they need to work on in therapy, regardless of any context that might suggest that there might have been something going on the therapist's end to contribute to whatever the client is bringing up. If you're noticing that you tend to respond to client feedback with more of a universal approach, whether it's more universally taking responsibility and apologizing, or more universally kind of deflecting it back onto, this is representative of something that's going on for the client and there's no responsibility on your part, then I do really encourage you to explore that in consultation, in your personal therapy, because the reality is every situation where a client gives us feedback is unique. And sometimes there might be something that we did wrong. Sometimes we might have done nothing wrong. And it's more important to take a genuine, curious, researcher mindset to say, I wonder what's going on here. Let's get to the bottom of this. Let's understand it so that we can address it accurately and effectively. I don't think leaning into those extremes applies to every single one of us. I think most of us are prone towards leaning towards one side or the other when we're in a place of feeling less secure, less confident, less stable, which could be something that's just happening in the moment, or we might kind of experience that insecurity more chronically. But I think when we're grounded and healthy, we don't tend towards those kinds of extremes, generally speaking. All right, so let's dive into some of the guidelines that I like to utilize when I receive constructive feedback from a client. Some of these guidelines are going to feel like complete common sense, but I'm going to try to list all of them for the sake of being thorough. And speaking of common sense, the first guideline when a client is giving you constructive feedback is to listen. I know that one might sound obvious, but when we're in a situation where we're feeling on edge or insecure, we might not even hear the client out fully and just jump straight into an apology or jump straight into defensiveness. Even if we're accurately perceiving whatever feedback our client is in the middle of telling us, like maybe an apology is called for, let's say, and we jump to that apology before they finish giving their feedback, they might feel like we didn't quite hear them because they didn't finish telling their story. So it's more important to spend some time listening, and if there's any sort of response on your part, to hold off until you feel like you really heard the whole thing from your client. The next guideline is, as one of the first things that you say whenever it's your turn to start talking after you've listened to your client, is to thank your client for speaking up about whatever they're bringing up. The reason I like to start with this right at the beginning is because almost all of us feel really uncomfortable giving feedback. I mean, you're giving feedback to your therapist. It can be terrifying. So even if in your mind the feedback is absolutely unfounded or distorted or whatever it might be, it's still an uncomfortable experience for your client in most cases. And so I think it's really helpful to just validate, like, wow, it took a lot of courage. I really appreciate you bringing this up, that sort of thing. The next guideline is to be curious. Like, genuinely try to tap into curiosity when you ask follow-up questions. Like, ask for specifics, tell me more. And if we can tap into a genuine curiosity to say, I really want to understand this better, I think that comes through to our clients. Because if we are leading with defensiveness or even from insecurity, feeling like we really did something wrong or missed the mark, and we ask questions, I think that comes through in our questions, and clients could sort of back down from their feedback. And in direct follow-up, the next guideline is to invite feedback. So that might just already be happening as you ask those curious questions, but we also want to make sure our questions include an invitation for feedback. Like, what sorts of things can I work on or change in order to improve the situation? Or, what sorts of things could I have done differently whenever the thing is you're giving me feedback about happened, so that I can learn for next time. Try to ask for as many specifics as you can because, again, your client most likely is very uncomfortable. So even though they managed to muster up the courage that it took to give you the feedback that they did, it's not unusual for someone to only give a percentage of the real feedback because it's still terrifying to tell you all of it. So they're giving you a little bit, like a little breadcrumb, seeing if you're safe enough to handle that little piece, because there's potentially sometimes a lot more information behind that little breadcrumb. So if there's any way to, again, curiously, genuinely ask for more specifics around the feedback that they're giving, that is likely sometimes going to unearth more information that your clients didn't tell you to begin with. Sometimes it might be that they didn't have the courage to tell you, and sometimes it might just be that, they haven't found a way to articulate all that they're maybe trying to give feedback on. So if you potentially offer leading questions in a situation like this, it can be helpful. So rather than saying something like, tell me more about what I could do differently, or are there any specifics you can name about what I could do differently, you could come back and name the specifics. Say like, okay, I remember when we had that conversation, I asked you this question. I'm curious how that landed for you. Was that kind of an example of what you're talking about? What did that feel like? Right? How could I have asked that question differently or approached that situation differently? Like, really get into it, because this is going to be helpful not just for this moment of feedback, but for all the other moments in the client's life when you're not there, they're interacting with somebody else, or they're just interacting in their own internal dialogue, and they may be helped by having this kind of insight building process in how you ask these questions. And then once you feel like you've gotten a pretty full picture of whatever the feedback is that your client is giving you, at least for now, then you can take responsibility for your part. Now, your part may be big and your part may be very small. So if there's an apology warranted, like you missed the mark, you made a genuine mistake, this would be the time to make the apology. I've talked about apologies a couple of videos back, but it's helpful to say more than just I'm sorry or I apologize, and to acknowledge specifically what it was that you did wrong, or you made the error, or whatever it is, and how you see that has negatively affected your client. Now, it may be that whatever your client is giving you feedback on isn't that you did something wrong unethical, immoral, or just, even a slip up. It might be you used some wording that you didn't even realize had some triggering weightiness to your client. And they're just giving you some feedback like, hey, when you use that word, this is how it feels for me. And you maybe didn't know that. You didn't do anything inherently wrong as you did it, but now that they gave you this feedback, you realize what that's like for your client. And so owning your part in this kind of situation would look more like acknowledging like, wow, I see how in your shoes, given XYZ, when you heard me say that, wow, that was so painful. And to just acknowledge like my action affected you, even if you didn't do anything wrong. It's really helpful to own that piece. It can be helpful to also check in to say, was that piece that I just acknowledged, does that kind of cover the areas of feedback, or were there other areas that I didn't acknowledge yet? So kind of check in, like, did I cover it? Am I missing something? Because sometimes we think we got it and then it's like, well, yeah, kind of, but no, there was more to the story. So feel free to check in again for more feedback. Then once you feel like you've fully gotten on the same page of taking ownership of whatever your part is and making sure you were clear on what that was, then it's a good time to collaborate on any changes to make together going forward. Now, of course, this would be the moment where if there's anything that you might have messed up on or you might want to change going forward, you can identify that together, collaborate on that. This would also be the space where if there's anything going on in your client's end, whether, it was a cognitive distortion, they catastrophized, they blew up at you. I mean, even if they had a completely legitimate type of feedback that needed to come out, but the way that they presented it to you was maybe less effective or more hurtful, this would be the space then to identify, how could we approach these kinds of things differently going forward. When you talk about this, try to be as specific as possible. So it's not just, okay, we'll try to be nicer next time or whatever it might be, but it might be, hey, next time I have this kind of thing that I'm going to say, maybe I'm going to use some different language that I know is hopefully a little bit less activating for you. And it sounds like, your takeaway is that you're going to practice using a gentler tone of voice when you deliver some feedback. Then it's really helpful to pause and zoom out and see if there's anything about what happened in that feedback experience that might also apply in the client's regular life outside of therapy. So this could be a question to kind of check in, like, okay, what was this like for you? Are there any moments in the rest of your life where you feel like you have similar feedback to give somebody, or, similar hurtful experiences, or whatever it might be, and see if there's other spaces in their life where they're, maybe catastrophizing the same way, or maybe they're not doing anything unhelpful in how they approach things, but maybe there's others in their life who aren't capable of owning their piece in the way that maybe you just demonstrated. So it's just really helpful to find what are the parallels, how did this interaction feel similar to other interactions, how was this interaction different from other interactions, or sometimes the interaction is just all in our client's head, their internal conversation, and then ask, like, is there anything about this that would be helpful to bring with you or apply in life outside of here? Now, of course, as I go through these guidelines, I'm aware that it's all the guidelines for like all the range of kinds of feedback that might happen. Sometimes feedback is just like a little thing that, maybe you're just spending 10 seconds, 30 seconds on it in session. You don't have to spend 30 minutes giving feedback about, I don't know, something tiny. Even thinking of things like, oh, it's cold in here. Can you turn up the heater or something? I mean, that's a type of feedback that we may not need to spend half a session talking about. So I'm just including all the guidelines here. And if it's a little blip, use your judgment to decide how many of these guidelines really are needed here. But if there is a more significant amount of feedback, category of feedback, then after the session's over, it's a really good idea to seek consultation. Again, it may not necessarily need to be a big consult, but just to kind of check in, like, ooh, my client gave me this feedback. I think I handled it pretty all right, but it might be a good idea to just kind of check in. Here's what happened. What do you think? Was there anything I might have missed there and want to, bring with me for next time? That sort of thing. And then, of course, if it was a more noteworthy kind of feedback, I'm not talking about like the can you adjust the AC type of feedback, but the bigger, more relational feedback, then it is really important to follow up. I usually like to follow up immediately the next session just to say like, hey, we we had a big conversation last time. You gave me some feedback. Again, I'm so glad that you did that. And just kind of circle back, like, how was that for you? Here's our plan going forward. Does that still feel all right? And then, of course, whatever the category of feedback your client gave you, to kind of check in whenever it's relevant to, if it's whenever we have this certain type of conversation, we're going to try to approach it differently. Well, then the next time you have that conversation after it ends, to say, hey, what do you think about how we approach this together? We talked about this however many sessions back. Did we effectively incorporate any of the feedback that you gave from last time? Or are there additional ways that we might like to keep improving our strategy for next time? Okay, now that we covered some of those best practices guidelines for how to approach client feedback, now let's talk a little bit about what not to do when getting client feedback. I know we can easily think of like the big things of what not to do, like don't yell, don't lash out at your client. But there are like sneaky ways that we can still be quite unhelpful or even harmful in how we respond to our clients, even when it comes in like pretty flowery packaging. Now, the first don't of how to respond to client feedback is being defensive. Now, I think we commonly think of defensiveness as like, no, I didn't do that, or you didn't understand, or let me explain what happened. But sometimes it can still come through in this kind of veiled way. I'm thinking of things along the lines of like, oh, I'm really surprised that you're only just now bringing that up because I've been doing it that way for months now. So I wonder what else might be going on. When maybe in an example like that, the client took so long to bring something up because it took that long for them to build up the courage to finally say something about it. I'm trying to come up with more examples of how this manifests, and I'm having a little bit of trouble naming the specific examples, but it's this way of sort of veiling our defensiveness in this kind of cover up. We're sort of excusing it through these things that kind of sound correct, and they may even be correct, but it's not helpful to use a defensive approach in how we respond. Another thing to avoid when responding to receiving client feedback is to be condescending. And again, I think we can kind of call to mind some of these more vivid pictures of what it looks like to be condescending, but there are subtle ways that we can be condescending. And this video, I'm talking specifically about getting that constructive feedback from your clients, but I see therapists be condescending all the time with everything. Just a couple days ago, I watched a role play that was supposed to demonstrate how the therapist should respond to the client completing their homework that they had been assigned the week prior. And this therapist, who was acting in a pretend, therapy session for this video role play, had this approach of like, oh, did you do your homework? You did such a good job. You did the whole thing. Wow, you should be so proud of yourself. And to me, that is just incredibly condescending, like you're speaking to a child. And yeah, the person they were talking to was not a child. Even with a child, sometimes that can be condescending. But my little venting moment aside, when we're talking about what it can look like to be condescending when we're receiving that kind of constructive feedback from clients, it could start to sound something like, oh, I didn't realize that my benign comment would trigger your sensitivity so much. Or, it's like putting it back on the client in this like, oh, it's because you can't handle it kind of way. Or, oh, I see that I accidentally bumped against your issue. We're not saying it in those words, but that's kind of the undertone between the lines. And we just veil it in this like therapist-y sounding language, and it drives me nutso when I see it happen. And another thing not to do in response to a client giving you feedback is attacking your client. We go there. If we're capable of attacking people we care about, we can attack our clients too. And it can start to sound something like, you always do this. Here's that problem again. Again, it's this dynamic of like subtly putting everything back on the client as their problem, which is just incredibly unhelpful and may only serve to worsen whatever it is that your client is looking for help from you for. And another don't when receiving constructive feedback from clients is don't deny their claim. Even if they're claiming something that you objectively are able to see, like, that did not happen. We have a different memory of that situation, or I even have some hard data to show that whatever you're claiming isn't true. Straight up denying the claim isn't going to help move things forward. If you're not seeing eye to eye on whatever your client is coming forward with, you have different perspectives, different memories of whatever happened, you can say things like, I'm having trouble fully understanding what you're describing. Can you help me fill in some of the blanks? Maybe here's some of the holes that I'm seeing. I haven't caught up with what you're saying yet here and here. Maybe some clarification is all it takes and you can come on the same page. Or if somehow, even after clarifications, you just really, you are not on the same page, or you have hard data to show that whatever your client is claiming is not true, it's still not helpful to just straight up deny the claim. Like, that did not happen. It's more helpful to say like, wow, how interesting. Like, I really remember this situation going like this, or how interesting, I have this kind of data point or whatever it is demonstrating that it looks like it went this way, but you have this really different memory. I wonder what that is. How do we talk about this, given that we're really remembering this differently or seeing it differently? That is far more helpful than just straight up denying whatever the client is bringing up. Well, I think that about sums up my general approach, general guidelines that I tend to use when a client is giving constructive feedback, especially more significant kinds of feedback that are, hard to hear. It's hard to hear constructive feedback, but let's keep in mind too that it's hard to give constructive feedback as well. And the hope is that these guidelines are helpful regardless of whether the responsibility falls on your end, you messed up maybe, you have something that you need to take ownership of, or if the client is the one who messed up or overreacted or whatever it might be, or some mixture of both. These guidelines should help you regardless, and that way you can more accurately and effectively problem solve, make changes, and move forward. Well, I hope you found this helpful, whether you're clicking on this video because maybe you just got some constructive feedback from a client, or, we've all been there before. It's bound to happen. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it will happen eventually. It's just part of being human. And so I hope these guidelines are helpful to you. And before we close, I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring this video. TherapyNotes helps with all of your practice management needs, from scheduling to notes to billing. They have a HIPAA-secure telehealth platform included for all users, and so much more. If you'd like to check out TherapyNotes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. Well, my friends, I don't think I will ever enjoy getting constructive feedback. I think it's just always hard for me, at least no matter what way you slice it. But I am genuinely grateful when I feel like both myself and my client can come together in finding a way to navigate it well. Like, maybe it can be a corrective emotional experience for them, and sometimes for me too. Not that that's why we're there, but if we can have a healthy moment together, like, that's helpful all around. Well, I hope you found this supportive and helpful. Let me know if you would add any guidelines to my tips here in the comments below. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.